Rome, in the 1st century AD, was not merely a city. It was the center of the known world, the heart of an empire that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the shores of North Africa. With a population exceeding 1 million people, it stood as the largest, most complex, and most influential urban center humanity had ever constructed. No city before it, and arguably few since, has wielded such absolute dominance over the political, cultural, and economic life of an entire civilization. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring ancient paintings, Renaissance artwork, archaeological reconstructions, and historical engravings to life. These tools allow us to shift perspective, change camera angles, and move through scenes that existed centuries or even millennia ago. We will walk through the same streets where emperors rode in triumph, where gladiators fought for survival, where merchants haggled over silk and spices, and where ordinary Romans lived, worked, and died. Rome's story is not the story of a single era. It is a continuous narrative spanning nearly 3,000 years, from a small settlement on 7 hills to the capital of a world empire, from the seat of medieval popes to the magnificent canvas of Renaissance artists. Each layer of Rome's history rests upon the foundations of what came before, creating a city where ancient temples stand beside Renaissance palaces, where medieval churches incorporate Roman columns, and where modern traffic flows around monuments that have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. What strikes me most about Rome is its persistence. Other ancient cities fell and were forgotten, their locations lost until archaeologists rediscovered them beneath desert sands or jungle growth. Rome never disappeared. It transformed, adapted, shrank, and expanded, but it never ceased to be inhabited. The Romans of today walk streets that their ancestors walked 2,000 years ago. They draw water from aqueducts that emperors built. They worship in churches constructed from the stones of pagan temples. This continuity makes Rome unique among ancient cities, a living museum where the past is not preserved behind glass, but remains woven into the fabric of daily life. Let us begin our journey in the age when Rome stood at the height of its power, when the Mediterranean was a Roman lake, and when the eternal city gleamed with marble temples, soaring aqueducts, and monuments designed to proclaim Rome's dominion over the world. The first image we examine shows the Flavian Amphitheater, known to later generations as the Colosseum, as it appeared in the early 2nd century AD. Rising 4 stories above the streets of Rome, its massive elliptical form dominated the valley between the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills. This was not merely a building. It was a statement of imperial power, a demonstration of Roman engineering genius, and a stage where the relationship between emperor and people was enacted through spectacles of blood and entertainment. Construction began under Emperor Vespasian around 70 AD, funded largely by treasures looted from Jerusalem following the Roman suppression of the Jewish revolt. The choice of location was itself significant. Vespasian built the amphitheater on the site of an artificial lake that had been part of Emperor Nero's vast and deeply unpopular Domus Aurea, his golden house. By giving back to the Roman people land that Nero had claimed for his private pleasure, Vespasian positioned himself as a ruler who served the citizens rather than exploiting them. The structure we see in this reconstruction could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, making it the largest amphitheater ever built. Its design influenced stadium architecture for the next 2 millennia. The tiered seating, the numbered entrances allowing efficient crowd movement, the covered passages protecting spectators from sun and rain, all these features would be replicated in sports venues throughout the modern world. What happened within those walls remains deeply troubling to modern sensibilities. Gladiatorial combat formed the centerpiece of entertainment, pitting trained fighters against one another in matches that frequently ended in death. But the spectacles extended far beyond gladiators. Wild animal hunts saw exotic beasts from across the empire: lions, elephants, bears, crocodiles, and creatures Romans had never seen before, slaughtered in the arena. Public executions transformed the deaths of criminals and prisoners into theatrical performances. Naval battles, made possible by flooding the arena floor, recreated famous maritime victories. The underground chambers beneath the arena floor, known as the hypogeum, contained a complex system of tunnels, cells, and mechanical lifts. Animals and gladiators could be raised suddenly into the arena through trapdoors, creating dramatic moments of surprise. Scenery could be changed between events, transforming the arena floor from a forest setting for an animal hunt to a desert landscape for a military reenactment. Looking at this recreation, I am struck by the sheer scale of organization required. Tens of thousands of spectators had to be seated according to strict social hierarchy. Senators sat closest to the action, then equestrians, then ordinary citizens, with women and slaves relegated to the uppermost tiers. Food and drink vendors moved through the crowds. Awnings were extended and retracted to provide shade. Perfumed water was sprayed to mask the smell of blood. The Colosseum was not just a building, but a massive machine for delivering entertainment, a demonstration of Roman organizational capacity applied to the task of keeping the urban population satisfied and distracted. Remarkably, this is a site you can still visit today. Though earthquakes, fires, and centuries of stone quarrying have reduced it to a partial ruin, the Colosseum remains Rome's most iconic monument. Walking through its corridors, you can still trace the paths that spectators followed 2,000 years ago, still stand on the arena floor where gladiators faced death, still feel the weight of history pressing down from every weathered stone. This view shows the Roman Forum as it appeared during the reign of Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century AD. What we see is not a single building, but a complex of temples, basilicas, monuments, and public spaces that had accumulated over centuries, each addition layered upon the foundations of what came before. This was the political, religious, and commercial center of Rome, the place where the fate of nations was decided, where triumphal generals celebrated their victories, and where the gods of Rome received their due. The Forum began as a marshy valley between Rome's hills, used first as a burial ground and later as a marketplace. As Rome grew from a small city-state to an imperial power, the Forum transformed with it. Temples rose to honor Jupiter, Saturn, Vesta, and the deified emperors. Basilicas provided covered spaces for legal proceedings and business transactions. Triumphal arches commemorated military victories over foreign enemies. Rostra, the speakers' platforms, served as stages for political oratory that could sway the course of Roman history. In the scene before us, we can identify several key structures. The Temple of Saturn, one of the oldest temples in Rome, housed the state treasury and served as the center of the December festival of Saturnalia. The Temple of Vesta, circular in form and attended by the Vestal Virgins, protected the sacred flame that symbolized Rome's eternal survival. The Curia Julia, the Senate house rebuilt by Julius Caesar and Augustus, provided the chamber where senators debated laws, declared wars, and advised emperors who increasingly ignored their counsel. The Basilica Julia, a massive hall along the south side of the Forum, served as a courthouse where legal disputes were adjudicated. Shopkeepers and money changers conducted business in the tabernae, lining the Forum's edges. Street vendors hawked their wares. Beggars sought alms, prostitutes solicited customers, politicians canvassed for votes, priests performed sacrifices. The Forum was simultaneously sacred and profane, a space where the highest matters of state intersected with the mundane business of daily life. Walking through this recreation, I try to imagine the sensory experience of the Forum. The smell of incense from the temples mixing with the odor of animal sacrifices, the smoke of cooking fires, the sweat of crowds, the sounds of orators declaiming, merchants shouting, hammers striking in nearby workshops, the rumble of carts on stone pavement, the visual cacophony of painted statues, gilded temples, bronze inscriptions, colorful awnings, and the ever-present crowds moving through spaces designed to impress and overwhelm. By the time this scene was created, the Roman Republic was already a distant memory. Emperors ruled with absolute power, and the political functions of the Forum had become largely ceremonial. Yet the Forum retained its symbolic importance. This was where Romulus was said to have founded the city. This was where the kings were overthrown and the Republic established. This was where Julius Caesar's body was cremated and Mark Antony delivered his famous funeral oration. Every stone carried the weight of centuries. Today, the Forum survives as an archaeological park in the center of modern Rome. The temples have been reduced to fragmentary columns. The basilicas are traced only by their foundation walls. Yet walking among these ruins, surrounded by tourists speaking dozens of languages, you can still feel the presence of those who walked here before. The Forum remains what it always was, a crossroads of the world. This image depicts the Pantheon as it appeared following its reconstruction under Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD. Of all the buildings of ancient Rome, the Pantheon is perhaps the most perfectly preserved, its dome intact, its proportions unchanged, its interior still capable of inspiring the same awe that visitors felt nearly 2,000 years ago. The current structure replaced an earlier temple built by Marcus Agrippa, Augustus's general and son-in-law, in the late 1st century BC. That original building was damaged by fire and rebuilt multiple times before Hadrian undertook its complete reconstruction around 120 AD. In a characteristic gesture of modesty, or perhaps political calculation, Hadrian retained Agrippa's original inscription on the facade, leading visitors to believe they were seeing the original building rather than its replacement. What makes the Pantheon remarkable is its dome. At 43.3 meters in diameter, it remained the largest dome in the world for over 1,000 years, until Brunelleschi completed the dome of Florence Cathedral in the 15th century. Even then, Brunelleschi drew inspiration from the Roman example. The dome is constructed from concrete, a material the Romans developed to a degree of sophistication that would not be matched until the 19th century. The concrete is graduated in density, with heavier materials at the base and lighter volcanic pumice near the top, reducing the structural load while maintaining strength. At the apex of the dome sits the oculus, a circular opening 9 meters in diameter that serves as the building's only source of natural light. Standing beneath the oculus, you look up through the dome's coffered interior directly at the sky. Rain falls through the opening, draining away through carefully designed channels in the marble floor. Sunlight moves across the interior walls as the day progresses, creating a connection between the building and the heavens. It was designed to honor. The Pantheon was built as a temple to all the gods of Rome, though scholars continue to debate exactly how it was used for worship. The interior contains 7 niches that may have held statues of the 7 planetary deities. The geometry of the building, with its perfect hemisphere resting on a cylinder of equal height, may have represented the cosmos itself, the dome as the vault of heaven, the cylinder as the earthly realm. What strikes me most about the Pantheon is how it feels to stand inside it. The proportions create a sense of harmony and balance that transcends conscious analysis. You feel small beneath the vast dome, yet also elevated, connected to something larger than yourself. This is what great architecture does. It shapes not just space, but emotion, not just vision, but spirit. The Pantheon survived the fall of Rome because it was converted to a Christian church in the 7th century AD. This transformation saved it from the quarrying that destroyed so many other ancient buildings. Today, it remains a functioning church, hosting regular masses beneath the same dome that once sheltered pagan worship. The tombs of Renaissance artists, including Raphael, rest in its niches, adding another layer to its historical accumulation. You can visit the Pantheon today free of charge and stand in the same space where Roman priests made offerings to Jupiter and Mars, where Renaissance cardinals contemplated the genius of their ancient predecessors, where tourists from around the world now gather to witness one of humanity's greatest architectural achievements. This reconstruction shows the Circus Maximus during a chariot race in the imperial period. The long elliptical track stretches between the Palatine and Aventine hills, filled with sand to provide traction for the horses and cushioning for the inevitable crashes. Around the track rise tiers of seating capable of holding over 250,000 spectators, making the Circus Maximus the largest venue for public entertainment in the ancient world. Chariot racing was Rome's most popular spectator sport, far surpassing even the gladiatorial games in the intensity of public passion it inspired. Racing teams were organized into factions identified by color: the blues, greens, whites, and reds. Fans supported their faction with a fervor that modern sports rivalries only approximate. Fights between supporters were common. Emperors who favored one faction over another risked political consequences. The races themselves were spectacular and dangerous. 4 chariots, one from each faction, would compete in each race, driving lightweight vehicles pulled by teams of 4 horses around the track 7 times. The total distance was about 8 kilometers, covered at speeds that made crashes frequent and often fatal. Drivers wrapped the reins around their waists to maintain control, a practice that made escaping from a crashed chariot nearly impossible. They carried knives to cut themselves free, but many died tangled in their reins and dragged around the track. The spina, the central barrier around which the chariots raced, was decorated with obelisks brought from Egypt, statues of gods and heroes, and lap counters in the form of bronze dolphins and eggs that were lowered one by one as each lap was completed. The turning posts at each end of the spina were the most dangerous points in the race, where chariots bunched together and collisions were most likely. Looking at this scene, I am struck by the engineering required to manage such massive crowds. The Circus Maximus had multiple levels of seating, numerous staircases and exits, food and drink vendors, betting operations, and the constant movement of horses, vehicles, and personnel required to run a full day of races. This was entertainment on an industrial scale, requiring organizational capabilities that matched or exceeded anything in the modern world. The emperors watched from a special box connected directly to the Palatine Palace above. From this vantage point, they could see and be seen by the enormous crowd, could reward favorite drivers with gifts, could respond to the collective demands of the Roman people. The circus was thus not merely entertainment, but a political space where the relationship between ruler and ruled was performed and negotiated. Today, the Circus Maximus survives as a large grassy park between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The seating is gone, the spina is marked only by slight depressions in the ground, and the track is now a popular spot for jogging and picnicking. Yet the shape of the valley preserves the memory of what happened here, and standing at one end, you can still imagine the thunder of hooves, the roar of the crowd, and the moment when a driver rounded the final turn toward victory or death. This view depicts the imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill as they appeared during the Flavian dynasty in the late 1st century A.D. The Palatine was the legendary birthplace of Rome itself, the hill where Romulus founded the city, and it remained throughout Roman history the most prestigious residential location in the city. By the imperial period, the hill had been transformed into a vast complex of palaces, gardens, and administrative buildings where the emperors lived and governed. The word palace itself derives from Palatine, a linguistic legacy of the hill's association with imperial residence. From Augustus onward, each emperor added to and modified the structures on the Palatine, creating an accumulation of building that eventually covered the entire hill. The Domus Augustana, constructed under Emperor Domitian, served as the official imperial residence for over 3 centuries. Its sunken garden, peristyle courtyards, and elaborate reception halls can still be partially traced among the ruins. Looking at this reconstruction, we see architecture designed to impress and intimidate. The scale of the buildings dwarfed ordinary human proportions. Visitors approaching the emperor would pass through progressively more magnificent spaces, each transition reinforcing the vast gulf between common subjects and the ruler who claimed descent from the gods. Marble from quarries across the empire covered the walls. Mosaics decorated the floors. Statues lined the corridors. Fountains provided the sound of running water. Every element was calculated to produce a specific emotional effect. Yet the palace was also a functional administrative center. Secretaries maintained correspondence with provincial governors. Accountants tracked the flow of taxes and expenditures. Petitioners waited in antechambers hoping for imperial attention. Guards patrolled corridors and monitored visitors. The palace was simultaneously a home, a government headquarters, a court of law, and a stage for the performance of power. The emperors who lived here ranged from the capable to the catastrophic. Augustus, who established the imperial system, maintained a deliberate modesty in his personal quarters even as he transformed Rome. Nero, whose excesses led to revolt and suicide, pushed the boundaries of imperial luxury until the palace became a symbol of tyranny. Hadrian, philosopher and builder, used the palace as a base for administering an empire at peace. The walls of the Palatine witnessed murders, conspiracies, love affairs, and the daily business of governing half the known world. Today, the Palatine Hill is an archaeological site where visitors wander among the fragmentary remains of imperial glory. Vaulted chambers emerge from the earth. Columns stand without their roofs. Gardens that once delighted emperors have become collections of labeled plants maintained by archaeologists. Yet the view from the Palatine remains spectacular. Looking down on the Forum on one side and the Circus Maximus on the other, you understand why this hill remained the center of power for over a millennium. This scene shows the Tiber River as it flowed through Rome in the imperial period, its banks crowded with warehouses, docks, and the constant traffic of commercial vessels. Like the Thames in London, the Tiber served as Rome's primary highway for heavy goods, connecting the city to the Mediterranean Sea and through it to the far corners of the empire. Rome's location, about 25 kilometers from the river's mouth, was carefully chosen by its founders. Close enough to benefit from maritime trade, far enough inland to provide some protection from naval attack. The river curved around the base of Rome's famous Seven Hills, providing natural defense on one side while serving as the principal route for commerce on the other. The port of Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, received ships from across the Mediterranean, grain from Egypt and North Africa, wine from Gaul and Spain, olive oil from the provinces, exotic goods from as far as India and China, all passed through Ostia before being transferred to smaller vessels and barges for the journey upriver to Rome. The city consumed resources on a scale unprecedented in the ancient world, and the Tiber made this consumption possible. Looking at this reconstruction, we see the river crowded with vessels of every type. Large cargo ships anchor in the deeper waters. Smaller boats navigate between them, ferrying goods and passengers. Barges heavy with grain move slowly upstream, pulled by teams of men or animals on the tow paths. Fishing boats cast their nets. Ferries carry travelers from bank to bank at points where no bridges exist. The Tiber was also essential for the city's water supply, at least until the aqueducts rendered river water unnecessary for drinking. It served as a sewer, receiving the outflow of the Cloaca Maxima and numerous smaller drains. It provided power for mills that ground the grain feeding Rome's population. It was a boundary marking the edge of the ancient city, a border that required bridges to cross. The bridges of Rome were themselves engineering marvels. The Pons Aemilius, built in the 2nd century BC, was the first stone bridge across the Tiber. The Pons Fabricius, constructed in 62 BC, survives today as the oldest Roman bridge in continuous use. These bridges linked the main city with the Trans-Tiberum district across the river, home to immigrants, sailors, and those who lived on the margins of Roman society. Flooding was a constant danger. The Tiber rose unpredictably, sending water surging through the low-lying parts of the city. Ancient sources record numerous devastating floods that destroyed buildings, drowned inhabitants, and left the forum submerged under muddy water. The Romans built embankments and attempted to regulate the river's flow, but complete flood control remained beyond their capabilities. Today, the Tiber flows through Rome between high stone embankments constructed in the 19th century. The commercial traffic is gone, replaced by occasional tourist boats and kayakers. The warehouses have been demolished, the docks dismantled, the towpaths paved over. Yet the river remains, flowing past monuments that have witnessed 25 centuries of history, connecting the ancient and modern cities in ways that other changes cannot erase. This image depicts a typical residential street in Rome during the 2nd century AD. Beyond the grand monuments and imperial palaces, the majority of Romans lived in conditions that modern viewers would find almost unimaginable. Understanding their daily experience helps us move beyond the marble facades to the human reality of ancient urban life. Most Romans lived in insulae, multi-story apartment buildings that crowded together along narrow streets. These structures rose as high as 7 or 8 stories, with ground-floor shops and workshops giving way to increasingly cramped apartments above. The lower floors, where water could be carried more easily and escape from fire was more feasible, commanded higher rents. The poor lived in the upper stories, climbing endless stairs to reach rooms that baked in summer and froze in winter. The insulae were built cheaply and maintained poorly. Collapses were common enough that ancient writers mentioned them casually. Fire was a constant danger in buildings where open flames provided the only light and heat. The Great Fire of 64 AD under Nero destroyed much of the city precisely because flames spread so easily through the densely packed wooden structures. Even after Nero instituted building codes requiring more stone construction, fires remained frequent. Looking at this street scene, we see the chaos of Roman urban life. Merchants display their wares on tables extending into the street. Customers haggle over prices. Slaves carry burdens for their masters. Litters convey wealthy citizens above the crowded streets. Children play among the pedestrians. Beggars seek coins. The noise must have been tremendous, a constant cacophony of voices, hammering, animal sounds, and the rumble of carts that were only permitted to enter the city at night. Sanitation was primitive by modern standards, though advanced compared to most ancient cities. Public latrines provided communal toilet facilities with running water carrying waste to the sewers below. But many apartments lacked any plumbing, forcing residents to carry chamber pots down flights of stairs or simply empty them out windows. The streets smelled accordingly. Water was available from public fountains fed by the aqueducts, but carrying it up to upper-floor apartments was exhausting labor. The wealthy had slaves to perform this task. The poor made do with minimal washing. Bathing was available at the public baths, massive complexes that provided not only hygiene, but social interaction, exercise, and relaxation. For a small fee, even the poorest citizen could enjoy hot baths, cold plunges, and hours of leisure in spaces decorated with marble and mosaics. Food came from the shops and stalls that lined every street. Most apartments lacked cooking facilities, making residents dependent on prepared food vendors. Hot food shops served soups, stews, and simple dishes. Bakeries produced bread that formed the staple of the Roman diet. Wine cellars offered drinks that were typically watered. The government distributed free grain to eligible citizens, a subsidy that helped prevent the food riots that might otherwise have threatened urban order. What strikes me most about daily life in ancient Rome is both its familiarity and its strangeness. The Romans dealt with traffic congestion, housing shortages, pollution, crime, and all the other problems of urban life that we recognize today. Yet they did so without electricity, without running water in most homes, without modern medicine, without police as we understand them. Their world was harder, more dangerous, and shorter-lived than ours, yet they built a civilization that continues to influence us 2 millennia later. This scene depicts Rome during the Great Fire of July 64 AD, when flames consumed much of the ancient city in a catastrophe that reshaped both Rome's physical landscape and its political history. What began as a fire in shops near the Circus Maximus spread rapidly through the densely built neighborhoods, burning for 6 days before being brought under control, then reigniting and burning for 3 more days. Ancient sources describe scenes of chaos as residents fled the advancing flames.
Water was available from public fountains fed by the aqueducts, but carrying it up to upper-floor apartments was exhausting labor. The wealthy had slaves to perform this task. The poor made do with minimal washing. Bathing was available at the public baths, massive complexes that provided not only hygiene, but social interaction, exercise, and relaxation. For a small fee, even the poorest citizen could enjoy hot baths, cold plunges, and hours of leisure in spaces decorated with marble and mosaics. Food came from the shops and stalls that lined every street. Most apartments lacked cooking facilities, making residents dependent on prepared food vendors. Hot food shops served soups, stews, and simple dishes. Bakeries produced bread that formed the staple of the Roman diet. Wine cellars offered drinks that were typically watered. The government distributed free grain to eligible citizens, a subsidy that helped prevent the food riots that might otherwise have threatened urban order. What strikes me most about daily life in ancient Rome is both its familiarity and its strangeness. The Romans dealt with traffic congestion, housing shortages, pollution, crime, and all the other problems of urban life that we recognize today. Yet they did so without electricity, without running water in most homes, without modern medicine, without police as we understand them. Their world was harder, more dangerous, and shorter-lived than ours, yet they built a civilization that continues to influence us 2 millennia later. This scene depicts Rome during the Great Fire of July 64 AD, when flames consumed much of the ancient city in a catastrophe that reshaped both Rome's physical landscape and its political history. What began as a fire in shops near the Circus Maximus spread rapidly through the densely built neighborhoods, burning for 6 days before being brought under control, then reigniting and burning for 3 more days. Ancient sources describe scenes of chaos as residents fled the advancing flames. The narrow streets that had made Rome so cramped now became death traps, choked with people attempting to escape while others tried to save their possessions. Looters mixed with refugees. The fire moved faster than people could flee, trapping some in dead-end alleys and collapsing buildings. When it finally burned out, 10 of Rome's 14 districts had been damaged, 3 completely destroyed.
For 3 days, the barbarians looted temples, palaces, and private homes, taking what they wanted and destroying what they couldn't carry. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Rome had not been captured by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The Eternal City had proved mortal. Further sacks followed. In 455, the Vandals stripped Rome of treasures that had accumulated over centuries, including the golden vessels looted from the temple in Jerusalem 400 years earlier. In 472 and 546, the city was captured again during the wars between the Eastern Roman Empire and the Ostrogothic kingdom that had replaced Roman rule in Italy. Looking at this reconstruction of late Roman streets, we see decline everywhere. Buildings that had been maintained for centuries now show signs of neglect. Population has fallen dramatically, from over 1 million at Rome's peak to perhaps 50,000. Whole neighborhoods stand empty. Aqueducts that no longer function have been abandoned. The forums that once thronged with crowds are now quiet, their temples closed, their basilicas repurposed or left to decay. Yet Rome did not simply end. It transformed. The Christian Church, which had grown powerful during Rome's final centuries, provided new forms of organization and meaning. Bishops replaced emperors as the city's leaders. Churches rose on the sites of pagan temples. Monasteries preserved something of classical learning even as the secular schools closed. The Pope, as Bishop of Rome, claimed authority that would eventually make him the spiritual head of Western Christendom. The physical city continued to shrink. Areas that had been densely populated reverted to farmland. The population clustered near the Tiber, abandoning the hills that had been prestigious addresses in imperial times. Cattle grazed in the Forum. Weeds grew through the pavement of ancient roads. The Colosseum became a quarry, its stones carted away for new construction. What strikes me most about Rome's fall is how gradual it was. There was no single day when Rome ended. People continued to live there, to marry and have children, to buy and sell, to worship and die. They walked streets that had been walked for centuries, past monuments they could no longer maintain, in a city that was slowly being forgotten by the wider world. The fall of Rome was not a collapse, but a fading, a gradual dissolution of everything that had made the city great. This view shows Rome in the medieval period, perhaps the 12th or 13th century, when the city had reinvented itself as the spiritual capital of Western Christianity. The population had stabilized at perhaps 30,000, a tiny fraction of its ancient peak, but Rome's significance had not diminished. Pilgrims from across Europe made the journey to venerate the tombs of Peter and Paul, to visit the churches built over Christian martyrs, and to seek the blessings that only the Pope could provide. The skyline had changed dramatically. The ancient temples were closed, their columns often incorporated into Christian churches. Towers built by noble families rose above the medieval streets, symbols of feudal conflict in a city without effective central authority. The old forums had become markets or grazing land. The Colosseum served as a fortress for one of the competing noble clans. Ancient Rome was being slowly dismantled, its marble burned for lime, its bronze melted for cannon, its stones carried away for new construction. Yet the medieval city was also building. Basilicas rose to honor the saints. Monasteries provided islands of learning and order. The Lateran Palace served as the papal residence, the center of an administration that claimed spiritual authority over all Western Christians. Pilgrims brought economic activity and cosmopolitan connections. Medieval Rome was poor by ancient standards, but rich in spiritual significance. Looking at this reconstruction of a medieval Roman street, I see a city very different from its ancient predecessor. The streets are narrower, the buildings lower, the population smaller. Ancient monuments loom in the background, too large to ignore, too expensive to maintain. Churches have replaced temples. Latin is still spoken, but it has evolved into the vernacular that will become Italian. The Roman Senate still meets, but it is now a municipal body with limited powers, bearing the same name as an institution that once governed an empire. The medieval period saw constant conflict between popes and emperors, between noble families competing for control of the papacy, between Rome and the increasingly powerful cities of northern Italy. Popes fled the city, taking refuge in France for most of the 14th century. When they returned, they found a Rome so ruined that one visitor described more churches in ruins than intact, more wolves in the streets than people. Yet medieval Rome preserved something essential. The memory of ancient greatness was never entirely lost. Visitors marveled at the ruins even as they stripped them for building materials. Scholars preserved Latin texts even as they forgot how to read Greek. The idea of Rome as the center of civilization survived even when the reality had become a depopulated ruin. This memory would provide the foundation for the remarkable transformation that was about to begin. This scene shows Rome in the early 16th century during the pontificate of Pope Julius II, when the city was being transformed by the vision of popes who sought to restore something of ancient glory. The Renaissance had come to Rome, bringing artists, architects, and scholars who would create works that still define the city today. Julius II, the warrior pope, embarked on an ambitious program of construction and renovation. He commissioned Bramante to design a new St. Peter's Basilica, tearing down the ancient church that had stood over Peter's tomb for over 1,000 years. He brought Michelangelo to Rome to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and to design his tomb. He employed Raphael to decorate the papal apartments. Under Julius and his successors, Rome became the greatest patron of arts in Europe. The new St. Peter's would take over a century to complete, passing through the hands of multiple architects including Michelangelo, who designed the great dome that dominates the Roman skyline. The project was financed partly through the sale of indulgences, a practice that would help trigger the Protestant Reformation and forever split Western Christianity. Yet the result was one of humanity's greatest buildings, a basilica that still serves as the center of Catholic worship and the seat of papal authority. Looking at this reconstruction of Renaissance Rome, we see a city in transition. Medieval towers still stand beside new palaces built in classical style. Ancient ruins provide inspiration for architects who study their proportions and imitate their forms. Streets are being widened, new piazzas created, fountains constructed to bring water from repaired aqueducts. The population is growing again, drawn by the economic opportunities created by the papal court. The artists who worked in Renaissance Rome created works that transcend their original religious purpose. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling tells the story of creation through figures of such power and beauty that they have become universal symbols of human aspiration. Raphael's School of Athens places the philosophers of ancient Greece in a setting of classical architecture, celebrating the human capacity for reason and knowledge. These works were created to glorify God and the Church, but they also glorify humanity itself. The Renaissance papacy was a complicated institution, combining genuine religious leadership with political intrigue, military ambition, and moral corruption. Popes fathered children, waged wars, and accumulated wealth while claiming to be vicars of Christ. The contrast between spiritual pretensions and worldly behavior scandalized many observers and contributed to the Protestant challenge. Yet the same popes who embodied the Church's failings also patronized the artists who created its greatest treasures. Walking through Renaissance Rome today, you encounter their legacy everywhere. St. Peter's still dominates the Vatican. The Sistine Chapel still receives millions of visitors. The piazzas and fountains still define the city's public spaces. The Renaissance created the Rome that tourists visit today, layering its own contributions over the ancient foundations that inspired them. This image shows St. Peter's Basilica as it appeared following its completion in the early 17th century. Rising on the Vatican Hill across the Tiber from the ancient city center, St. Peter's is the largest church in the world, capable of holding over 20,000 worshippers beneath its vast dome. More than a building, it is a statement of Catholic faith and papal authority, a monument designed to overwhelm visitors with the power and permanence of the Church. The site has been sacred since the 1st century A.D., when the Apostle Peter was martyred in Nero's circus, which stood nearby. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, built a basilica over Peter's tomb in the 4th century. That church served as the center of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, accumulating treasures, relics, and the tombs of popes. When Julius II decided to replace it with something grander, he set in motion a project that would consume the resources of the papacy for over a century. Bramante's original design was modified by successors including Raphael and Antonio da San Gallo, before Michelangelo took charge in 1546. Already over 70 years old, Michelangelo worked on St. Peter's without payment for the last 17 years of his life, regarding it as his service to God. His dome, inspired by Brunelleschi's dome in Florence but larger and more complex, rises 136 meters above the floor of the basilica. It can be seen from across the city, a landmark that orients visitors and reminds residents of the church's presence. The interior is overwhelming in its scale and decoration. Bernini's baldachin, a bronze canopy over the papal altar, rises 30 meters high, using bronze stripped from the portico of the Pantheon. His design of St. Peter's Square, with its embracing colonnades, creates an outdoor space that can hold hundreds of thousands for papal audiences and major celebrations. Every surface is covered with marble, mosaic, gilt, and sculpture, the accumulated offerings of centuries of papal patronage. Looking at this reconstruction, I try to imagine the experience of a pilgrim approaching St. Peter's for the first time. The vast square, the looming facade, the doors that seem designed for giants rather than humans. Entering, you find yourself in a space so large that perspective itself becomes unreliable. The bronze letters around the base of the dome, each over 2 meters tall, appear normal-sized from the floor below. Statues that seem life-sized from a distance prove to be 3 times human height when approached. Everything is designed to make the visitor feel small, to emphasize the vastness of God and Church compared to individual human insignificance. Today, St. Peter's remains the center of Catholic worship. The Pope celebrates major masses at the papal altar. Pilgrims wait in long lines to enter the basilica and venerate Peter's tomb in the crypt below. Tourists crowd the interior, taking photographs despite prohibitions, marveling at the same sights that have impressed visitors for 4 centuries. The building continues to serve the purposes for which it was designed, connecting the present to a sacred history stretching back to the foundations of Christianity. This view shows the interior of the Sistine Chapel, focusing on Michelangelo's famous ceiling painted between 1508 and 1512. Though smaller than St. Peter's, the Sistine Chapel is in some ways more significant, for this is where the cardinals gather to elect new popes, where the most sacred ceremonies of the Church are performed, and where Michelangelo created what many consider the greatest work of art in human history. The chapel was built under Pope Sixtus IV in the late 15th century, its proportions deliberately matching those of Solomon's Temple as described in the Hebrew Bible. The walls were decorated by the greatest painters of the day, including Botticelli, Perugino, and Ghirlandaio. Their frescoes depict parallel scenes from the lives of Moses and Christ, establishing the theological continuity between Old and New Testaments. Yet these accomplished works are overshadowed by what Michelangelo painted above them. Michelangelo was primarily a sculptor, and he initially resisted the commission to paint the ceiling. He suspected his enemies of arranging the project to discredit him through failure in an unfamiliar medium. Yet once he began, he became consumed by the work. For 4 years, he labored on scaffolding. He designed himself, painting while lying on his back, destroying his eyesight and damaging his health. The result justified every sacrifice. The ceiling depicts 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, from the creation of light to the drunkenness of Noah. The most famous image, the creation of Adam, shows God reaching out to give life to the first man, their fingers nearly touching in a moment of divine and human connection that has become one of the most reproduced images in history. Around the central scenes, Michelangelo painted prophets, sibyls, and the ancestors of Christ, creating a theological program that unfolds across over 500 square meters of painted surface. 25 years after completing the ceiling, Michelangelo returned to the Sistine Chapel to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall. This massive fresco depicts Christ returning to judge the living and dead, surrounded by saints and angels, with the damned being dragged down to hell by demons. The work is darker, more troubled than the ceiling, reflecting both Michelangelo's advancing age and the religious crisis of the Reformation era. Standing in the Sistine Chapel today, surrounded by crowds of tourists from every nation, you can still feel the power of what Michelangelo created. The ceiling remains astonishing, its colors restored by controversial cleaning in the 1980s and 90s. The figures seem to move, to breathe, to exist in a realm between the human and divine. This is what art can achieve at its highest expression, a transformation of matter into meaning, of paint into prayer. Standing here, looking back at these images spanning nearly 2,000 years, I am struck by Rome's remarkable capacity for survival and reinvention. Other great cities of antiquity, Babylon, Persepolis, Alexandria, have become archaeological sites, their populations scattered, their continuity broken. Rome never stopped being a city. Through invasion, plague, fire, and decline, people continued to live, work, and die in the shadow of monuments that connected them to an unbroken past. The Rome of today is all of these Romes simultaneously. Ancient columns support medieval churches. Renaissance palaces overlook streets laid out by emperors. Baroque fountains splash in piazzas where markets have gathered for 2 millennia. The past is not buried or preserved behind glass, but woven into the fabric of daily life, visible at every turn, impossible to ignore. Walking through modern Rome, you encounter history at every step. You cross bridges that Caesar knew. You enter temples that Hadrian built. You stand where gladiators died, where popes were crowned, where Michelangelo painted, where fascists marched, where filmmakers created movies that changed cinema. Every stone has witnessed something. Every corner has a story. What strikes me most is the reminder that cities, like civilizations, are not permanent. Rome rose from a small settlement to rule the Mediterranean world. It fell, shrank to a fraction of its former size, and reinvented itself as the capital of a spiritual empire. It has been invaded, sacked, bombed, and occupied. Yet it persists. The idea of Rome, the memory of what Rome was and might be again, has proven more durable than any of its buildings. Perhaps this is the most important lesson Rome offers. Civilizations rise and fall, but they also transform. The Roman Empire ended, but Roman law still shapes our legal systems. Latin died as a spoken language, but its descendants are spoken by hundreds of millions. The emperors are gone, but the roads they built still carry traffic. Nothing lasts forever, but nothing is ever entirely lost. If there is another city, another moment in time, or a historic scene you would like to see brought back to life, let me know in the comments below. I would love to continue building this journey into the past with you. Together, we can walk streets that no longer exist, enter buildings that crumbled centuries ago, and glimpse what it was like to live in worlds that seem remote, yet remain connected to our own. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Rome. The Eternal City has been waiting for over 2,000 years. It will be waiting still when we return.